ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back Michael Kimmelman and panelists Killian Kleinschmidt, Tara Nathan, and Don Weinreich.
So thank you all. By the way, thank you all for being here. We're coming to the end of our day, and I'm so grateful that you're all here. And I'm hoping we'll end with a bang to talk about a subject that's I personally find incredibly interesting and I think is very important today in the world, and will be one of the most important subjects, I think, as the century unfolds. I want to begin in the time we have to ask Killian to describe a little bit what it was like to run the Zaatari camp and what happened in Zaatari that really provokes us to have this conversation.
Zaatari, or Zaatari, as it is also called, is one of the largest refugee camps in the world. And what you have to imagine is somewhere next to the Syrian border, 6-7 miles from the Syrian border, 3,000 people arriving every night with nothing, being checked into a place which is meant to keep people alive. It was built as a storage facility, pending that there would be peace in Syria, which of course we know hasn't happened since then. And then I was called there in 2013 because the then about 100,000 people were rebelling every day against what they considered inhuman assistance, because they wanted something else. So we had daily demonstrations, stone throwing, and so on, despite the fact that the water was right, they got their 18 liters and more, they got their 2,100 calories, they had their tents, they had medical assistance, they had anything what we had described as the standard for humanitarian assistance, and yet they were unhappy.
Why? Why were they unhappy?
Because, and this is maybe a surprising discovery, we didn't treat them as human beings. We looked at them as commodities. We looked at this as a logistic challenge. We looked at this as, well, numbers, and again, the numbers of calories and water. And there's something which is very important. It is beyond survival. And it is the right for people to have their identity recognized, their individual needs recognized, and there's nothing more dehumanizing than, particularly in a crisis situation where you have lost everything up to your family photos, to be treated exactly the same, that we all drink the same, we eat the same, we are dressed the same, everything the same. And that is what humanitarian assistance is all about right now. So there's a need for change.
So, okay, so very quickly, and then we will turn to what we can do in the future. What happened there in Zaatari was kind of amazing, because if I may fill in some of the details, you began to see that people sort of took over the camp for themselves. And it seemed when I arrived there, you had streets with shops, you had a pizza delivery service. You said to me you're trying to figure out how they figure out where everybody is, because you don't even know for sure. They had travel agency. People had created a city. It was on some level, a very beautiful thing to see, this desire to urbanize and to create a place, even in the place that people desperately didn't want to be.
It was a messy state of self-organization. We tried to put tents and then later living containers, by the way, all bought for a lot of money. We could have done it differently, into rows. And within 5 minutes, they moved it, and they created their own spaces. And once we had discovered that it was important to them to actually be able to design their own spaces, we let them do. We didn't object anymore. When we discovered that the streetlights we had put up, 250 electricians organized by the refugees themselves stole the power and connected almost 100% of the households to the grid, we started stealing the electricity together with them and managed it together with them. So it was recognizing that desire. When they stole 85 buildings disappearing because we had built communal toilets, communal showers, and communal kitchens, they didn't want to do it together. They wanted to be for themselves and to regain that pride a human being deserves. So they all built private toilets, totally messy, pits, and so on. But it was a question of doing it together with them and gradually recognizing that this was the way forward.
Okay, so we have, by various counts, 60 million refugees in the world. And this doesn't include lots of probably uncounted and people with emergency relief from natural disasters as well. Anyway, the point is the population seems to be growing.
45,000 people since this morning.
There you go.
45,000 since this morning, and that's its only forced migration by war and conflict. The others moving because of climate change and because of poverty, and having actually done the mistake of not having started a war, we call them migrants.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there is an issue there as well.
Okay, so but the point is that the way we respond to this now is through emergency relief, with this idea that somehow these people will be put someplace in a host country perhaps, which doesn't want them to stay. And what we have as an example there in Syria is in Jordan of the Syrian refugees are people who were probably going to have to stay, and so are creating a place for themselves of some implicit or in fact permanence. So then the question becomes, how can we rethink refugee camps and the refugee population, and what does it imply beyond the refugee population for creating places that benefit the host country, that benefit the refugees, that have a sense of permanence. Let me just turn to Don for a second. Don, maybe you can describe how you got involved in this and, and why you entered this.
Well, very briefly, I'm an architect and by no means an expert in refugee camps, but a few years ago I was asked by a friend who is an expert in refugee law to help him and help UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, rethink how emergency responses are undertaken by what's probably the single most effective actor in the field, albeit an imperfect actor. So that's how we began to get involved. And where that took us was to an arm's length analysis. And it was sort of the beauty of being totally naive. You could look at everything somewhat objectively and not play favorites. And what we saw was a landscape where the UNHCR really didn't have the tools that it needed to respond effectively. They were very good at keeping people alive at a kind of biological level, but they really were not town planners. There was no real integration with the private sector. And because of the politics of permanence, and it really wasn't their business to deal with permanence. Their business was to keep people alive. They couldn't plan adequately for a longer-term outcome.
So what have you been thinking about in terms of what can be done to design these places?
Okay, so a number of things. So the first thing we're doing is designing a framework for even thinking about it, because I think, as everyone has heard today, that the dimensions of these problems are so immense and so complex. If you don't organize your thinking, you're really going to be lost very quickly. So we're looking at 3 geographic scales, a region where conflict might emerge, and understanding where people might successfully be relocated. We're looking at the relationships between a host community and a refugee community, and that's really what we should talk about the most, and then looking at the micro scale of camps themselves. We're doing this across 4 time scales: advanced planning, an emergency response, a durable phase, and an exit strategy, because a refugee's right under international law is to go home. And what happens to Zaatari when and if the Syrians go home? There's some amazing stuff has been built.
Let's get to that in a moment. I want to introduce Zaatari because one of the other things that happened, Killian, at Zaatari is that you began to have private companies and others who saw these large places like this, virtual cities, pop-up cities, as places of opportunity. For you at MasterCard, what is the interest in this particular kind of community in place?
Sure. So the first thing, I might give a couple of sentences on sort of MasterCard and what we do. I think most people here probably think of us from the credit card in your wallet that's hopefully in your wallet. But actually, we're a payments technology company. So we're a technology company, and what we do is we lay financial roads. So if you think about it, we're very actively engaged in cities and in the expansion and in the establishment of financial infrastructure in cities, right? So natural fit there from working with large cities around the globe to implement transportation systems or salary payment systems or benefit disbursement systems, doing the same thing in a refugee context. I think one of the things we talked about, you talked about the politics of impermanence. I think you may know the number better, but the average refugee actually is in camp 16 plus years.
17.
Years.
Right.
So there's very little impermanence involved here. And I think so where MasterCard, really has gotten involved is to say, how can we take what is our core competence in building financial payments ecosystems and apply them to these cities to not just create sort of a point solution, right? Not just sort of deliver the aid for tomorrow, the bag of rice, the liter of water, but to really create a financial payments ecosystem that can lead to not just individual empowerment, but city growth.
Right.
So enable commerce.
So, Killian, in fact, what kind of commerce was or is Zaatari producing? I mean, it was a real economy when I last asked you about this, yes?
Absolutely. 3,000 self-organized illegal shops organized by the refugees themselves with probably, we think, a monthly turnover of about $15 to $20 million. But then, and that's where MasterCard and others come in, there were also 2 official supermarkets established by the United Nations World Food Programme in cooperation with the private sector, and suddenly people could make their own choices. And there we used smart cards for people to move from aid recipients to shoppers who would be making choices. And that is a very important element of dignity. Now, what we really looked into is, again, and I think it's not important whether a place lives 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. The moment you have thousands of people together, first of all, their behavior change is very visible. It's clear they're urbanizing. So you have to deal with this as an urban center. I mean, nobody says how long a city has to live.
Right.
Burning Man lives a few days.
Right.
And in the same way, a refugee camp is either days or it's years. Now, the question is, when you begin to invest as you would invest into a city with the same structures of public-private partnerships, of the whole setup. So we, for instance, we called in the city of Amsterdam, and the city of Amsterdam started cooperating with us in the camp. It wasn't an entirely satisfactory process because we hadn't really prepared it, but it was one way forward. Or water companies from Amsterdam and also of the city of Marseille helping us to actually redesign the water systems. So these are ways of how to recognize the urban character. And this is not only for the camp in Jordan, but this is the situation everywhere. And we should also not forget that only 20% of the world's displaced are actually living in camps. Maximum. The rest goes into other communities and adds to the people. I was just a few weeks ago in northern Iraq, in Kurdistan. A place like the city of Duhok, by the way, quite beautiful area, and it's very peaceful. You can all go. They have suddenly moved from a population of 800,000 people to a population of 1.4 million people. Mm-hmm. Some new settlements, that's the camps. The humanitarian agencies broke, have no real capacities and know-how and money to really deal with this. And is the city itself bursting with people. So what do you need is you. The people sitting in this room. That is the knowledge, there's the money, there's the know-how the city managers of Duhok need today.
So Don, when you talk about these different stages of development, one of the obvious issues, a political as well as a practical issue, is how do you persuade a country, let's take Jordan for example, to host refugees if they know that this is going to be a place that people will stay for a long period of time? And how can you persuade them that building infrastructure and doing all the stuff that creates permanence and prosperity is also going to be something for them?
Right. Well, I think that's the right question to ask. And the project we've been involved in now and still are is trying to turn the premise on its head. You can look at refugees as a burden and think of camps as containment centers, and you pour in charity and wash your hands of it. But there's really a very different kind of premise which we think is better, which is to see refugees as resources, as assets. They can bring with them benefits not only to themselves, but to host communities. So to answer your question specifically, I'll talk about it at two scales. One is at this regional planning scale, and using GIS tools and things like that, you can create layered maps of regions to see where there might be a healthcare supply deficit or a water deficit, you name it. So once you have these spots developed or identified, negotiators who are seeking land have a card up their sleeve to say, if you allow us to bring refugees here, we'll build facilities not only sufficient for the refugees, but also for your community. And if and when the refugees go home, this asset belongs to the host.
Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what we look at, which is, I want to pick up on that point of building reusable infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the key things that we think is critical, especially in this environment where aid budgets are not rising to meet sort of the demand, right, on the humanitarian front. So one of the things that we spend a lot of time looking at is how can you create infrastructures that are reusable? So it's not about, well north of 80% of all aid is actually delivered in kind, right? So, and a fraction of every penny, a fraction of every dollar reaches the end aid recipient. I think what we're very interested in is how do you create an infrastructure, if it's digital cash or it's digital aid or digital money, that can then serve a broader range of NGOs, that then serves as an infrastructure that once the intervention, the humanitarian intervention is over, that the post-conflict, post-crisis development can start to happen on that same infrastructure, whether it is power or water or payments or whatever, right? So that you're actually leaving behind a vibrant economy.
Yeah, I mean, it seems economically beneficial to everybody involved. I think when I was there, you were telling me that it's an insane system in which you have to retrofit the camp for the electricity and the water and sewage, which could have been done at a fraction of the cost. You're shipping in water when you could have had a system already in place.
I mean, the annual budget in a camp with 100,000 people for trucking water in and getting dirty water out is about $30 million at the cost in Jordan. Let me use that example. So it would be very good to build up a water system. Now, the humanitarian system doesn't have the real expertise to actually design a water system. So I just say that there was a design which people said would cost $18 million. A $1 million electricity bill for that camp for stolen, quote-unquote, electricity for, again, electricity brings change, social development, economic development, so I thought it was very important. But a $1 million bill to the aid system, and at the same time, we could have produced our electricity, we could have had the refugees be held accountable for the electricity being used with prepaid meters or circuit breakers or whatever. I mean, it's not because you're a refugee, you're not supposed to pay and be accountable. And again, and I think the aid budget issue is a very big one. I don't think anybody realizes that the entire aid budget for the world, the humanitarian aid budget for emergency aid, is $24 billion only. So we were talking about developments in New York City, which are more than the entire aid budget for not only 60 million displaced and refugees, but also for millions of others getting displaced by floods and earthquakes and so on and so forth.
So, I mean, you're describing a completely dysfunctional system in which the economy is obvious to build permanent infrastructure and think about this, but the whole system is built on an emergency relief philosophy, which is completely self-defeating. It's wasting the little money it has. So how, then, the question has to be, how can we begin to flip the system? Who is in charge to begin to say, okay, look, this has to be thought of in a completely different way?
I think it's our common responsibility. I mean, we are together in this world. Let's be clear. It's to find answers to this, and we have the answers. There's an answer to any problem somewhere in the world. Somebody has the resource in one corner of the world. So we need to connect that. This is what I do now, connecting. So the business, the public sector, we can offer these solutions to governments. We can relieve the relief agencies from doing something they actually don't know to do and don't want to do. And here I want to quote my ex-boss, High Commissioner Guterres, who says very clearly, we're doing things we shouldn't be doing. He still refers to the development sector to come in. I would say there's a very, very strong requirement for the public and the private sector to come together. Again, doing good is good for business, bringing in the many people in this world who are not part of the economic cycle into it, we all know makes sense. So let's do it. But again, we need to pool the resources which sit on one end of the world, and it can be in the south as well, and connect them to somewhere else. That's the positive effect of
Tara, you agree with this, I assume?
Yeah, I agree violently, I think. It's, I think there's a huge emergence of a big trend, I'd say, over the course of the past maybe 2-3 years. There's been a lot of discussion, but in the last year, I've seen a real crescendo and a call for public-private partnerships. And in really at a meaningful implementation level to sort of say, how can, as Killian mentions, how can the public sector or UN agencies more effectively leverage private sector capabilities, right? Instead of rebuilding, not even just rebuilding what the private sector has mastered and can do in spades, but frankly, even rebuilding and duplicating efforts within the UN system over and over. Right. So I would echo the point for better coordination sort of within the UN and humanitarian system, and also greater public-private cooperation.
Right. I see Charles standing up. Do you have a question, Charles?
I think we only have time for, unfortunately, one quick question. For the people in this audience, for folks who are U.S. citizens, what should we know and be doing regarding the newest cities that are emerging, and how should we be supporting the efforts to make them better?
Don, I'm going to ask you first because you have an interesting idea.
Yeah. Well, bring refugees to the United States. Open the borders to a degree and have a controlled influx, welcoming people into our cities, particularly cities that are in states of decline or are losing population, and let this tremendous energy that you see in a place like Zaatari create the next economy.
Guys?
I might take a different angle, which is I'd say speak up and be active in the government process. So the U.S. government is one of the biggest supporters, or the biggest culprits, I should say, of in-kind aid. And there has been sort of a general movement towards creating greater efficiency and accountability by moving towards more what they call cash programming, which is just essentially digitizing aid. Basically, I would say, as U.S. citizens, I think we need to be more active in that dialogue to sort of speak up and to demand efficiency, to demand accountability, and to push towards more efficient forms of aid.
Well, I could not agree more. Free movement of people in the world is required, and it doesn't threaten anybody, and it provides new opportunities. But of course, the other answer as well is we need to pool the world's resources, get them together, make them known, and share them in a different way. And again, I think in the US, there's a lot of capacity in terms of capital, in terms of know-how, best practice, some not so good practice, but a lot of capacity which can be shared with other parts of the world. And that we need to get together. We need to create that platform which can do this. And it shouldn't be an ad hoc, little here and a little there. We need to bring it together into a holistic, comprehensive package which we bring in. And again, we have heard about developments of $15 billion in New York alone. With that, we can do wonders in a place which is falling apart, such as northern Iraq, Lebanon, or many other parts of the world which are hosting many more displaced and refugees than we can even believe.
So thank you all very much for opening this conversation. I'm really very grateful. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks. I'll stand up. And I wanted to thank all of you for coming today. We're done with what I hope has been a rewarding day, and I know has been great for us to put together. And so I just wanted to thank you again, and we all look forward to seeing you next year. So thanks.